Colleague Nastassia Arendse is standing by. Very good afternoon to you, Nastassia. You've been speaking to analysts about if or how this may move the markets. What are they saying?
So, as you said, most part of the mornings was me talking to analysts in terms of the trading screens. These guys sit in front of screens most of the day to try and find out what exactly happened. Was there any kind of reaction? And at this point, there was no reaction. And that's because the rand has been affected by global factors as opposed to what was happening in South Africa as it related to former President Jacob Zuma. But the one thing that the market did cheer was the fact that South Africa's rule of law is still standing. And it matters because if you go back to May, when Fitch affirmed South Africa's rating at BB-, right down at the bottom of that report, there's a section that looks at ESG and governance. And when it comes to Fitch's ratings on that, South Africa scores a 5. And that 5 relates to political stability, rights, rule of law, institutions, and regulations. And the reason why that 5 is important, because it's right on par with the World Bank's governance index, where we sit at a 58th percentile. And the reason I mention is that 58th percentile is important because it mentions that it reflects South Africa's relatively strong institutions and a well-entrenched democratic process. But when Fitch was reviewing South Africa's ratings, they brought in that aspect in terms of where we're sitting with the WGBI index. And they mentioned that during that period of state capture, our rule of law made them question a whole host of things, including whether our rating at that 5 and that 58th percentile was either probably overstated, and that raised questions. And I think if we didn't have the Constitutional Court step in and say something, and we didn't have our former President Jacob Zuma hand himself over, it would have raised questions. One of the market watchers said it wasn't going to be something we would have seen with the rand reaction, an immediate reaction, but it would have been a reaction that would have at least shown over the past few days as investors try to digest what this really means for South Africa's rule of law. When you talk about, President Cyril Ramaphosa's investment drive, one of the things multinationals and investors look for is, the rule of law. It makes a big difference, especially when you take into consideration, indexes like the World Justice Project Index, where they look at the rule of law. South Africa there scores 44 out of 128 countries. Top-ranking countries are countries such as Denmark, Norway, and Finland. And when you look at their economic performance, they're able to bring in foreign direct investment. But when you look at countries that are sitting right at the bottom of that index, countries like the DRC and Venezuela, there's an FDI problem in terms of attracting investment. So this was a thumbs up from a market's perspective, from observers, both local and international, saying that we respect the fact that, your rule of law is still standing. That's one of the things we look for outside of the cost of doing business as well as access to markets.
Nastassia, in the beginning you said, the rand is determined by global factors, not so much domestic issues. We saw, though, when former President Jacob Zuma resigned, that the rand was around 1166, 1170, and there was a direct impact on his actions on the rand. So just explain to our viewers why there's a difference now.
So I think this particular difference, not to say that it didn't have an effect, but when you look at the way the rand performed between yesterday and today, that effect was marginal. It was almost as though we didn't really notice. When I talk about some of these global factors, the big news yesterday that came out was the FOMC minutes. There's still that angst whether the Fed Reserve will pull back and start raising interest rates, which will affect emerging market currencies. But when you look back to that time when former President Jacob Zuma stepped down, there was a lot of information coming in terms of following all the news that we'd heard about corruption and various other allegations that were swirling around at the time. Investors at that particular time were wondering what is the next step, what will happen, and what will the next person who comes in bring in when it comes to a lot of the issues that the ratings agencies had raised at the time in terms of reform. What does that mean? And we saw that positive reaction. But there were also probably other global factors that were swirling around that would have given that positive reaction for the rand. You would assume that would have been the same thing, though, given last night's news. But marginal difference. I mean, when we kicked off early this morning at 7 o'clock, the rand was trading at probably around 13.38. It then moved to 13.44, and right now it's 13.38. So we're in that 13.50, 13.44 range right now, where it's a lot of the global factors that are playing out and affecting the rand. The one thing I do think that investors are going to pay attention to is, of course, what's happening with the COVID vaccination drive and the different variants that everyone seems to be talking about. But they're also going to be looking at, divisions within the ANC. Whether that's going to have a material effect on the rand is something that we will continue to monitor.
Nastassia Arendse, our markets anchor, coming to us live from the Johannesburg Stock